Welcome to the March 8, 2021 City Council work session. Thank you for this remote meeting format we're using in response to Governor Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives order. This format enables the City Council to meet and take care of business while keeping everyone safe. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. Looking ahead, tonight's regular meeting will include both a public forum and 3 public hearings. Information about how to participate is available on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And as always, other avenues of communication with me and City Councilors are available, including email and voicemail. So thank you all for taking time out of your evening to join us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the City Manager for the first agenda item.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. We're definitely rolling into 3 important topics as you kind of finish out your winter, anyway, term of work before you go on your spring break. So tonight we'll be doing clear and objective standards, and we'll also have urban renewal, downtown urban renewal update, and then we have housing tools and strategies. So all 3 of those are areas that you listed as sort of high important goals for you. So I'm excited to talk about them. I do want to say one thing, because I think Janessa will be probably kinder, which is we're having a public hearing on this clear and objectives later this evening. So the purpose of this evening's work session is to give you some information about that, so you just kind of know what's coming. It's not really to get into the debate of whether you like it or you don't like it. We'll be coming back after the public hearing with either a work session or an action item, or both, depending on how tonight's public hearing goes and how that goes for you. So with that, I will turn it over to Janessa to walk through the clear and objective standards.
Thank you, Sarah. Give me a second to share my screen here. Okay, can I get a head nod that that's showing up? Great, thank you, Sarah. Okay, good evening. I'm Janessa Dragovich, Senior Planner and Project Manager for the Clear and Objective Update. Later this evening, as Sarah mentioned, you'll be hosting a public hearing on the draft ordinance to implement the land use code changes addressed under the scope of this project. Before we get into the project overview, though, I wanted to provide some context, as it's been a while since we've been here. Housing supply and affordability challenges are being felt state and even nationwide. You may recall that the purpose of Oregon's statewide planning goal 10 is to provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state. State law also requires that the city adopt and apply clear and objective standards for housing, and stipulates that these standards may not discourage housing through unreasonable cost or delay. As you know, the state has passed multiple pieces of legislation in the last few years to address the growing housing crisis, including a change that made the clear and objective entitlement applicable to all housing and not just needed housing as defined by the state. This project updates and refines our existing clear and objective approval criteria for land use applications that involve housing. So what does clear and objective mean? It means that cities must have clear, prescriptive standards for both by right developments, such as building permits for new houses, and approval criteria for land use applications that provide housing, such as subdivisions. Basically, it means our standards must be measurable. An example I like to use relates to compatibility. An approval criterion that says a development must be compatible is vague and highly subjective. In contrast, a criterion that imposes a measurable setback is a clear and objective, prescriptive approach to address some common compatibility concerns. Housing Tools and Strategies, which you will have a work session on this Wednesday, has become a large umbrella project encompassing several local housing initiatives. While the Clear and Objective project began before its initiation, it clearly fits under this umbrella. The housing crisis is a problem that crosses many departments and work groups, so solutions take time, process changes, and thoughtful balancing of values. As the economic consultants for Housing Tools and Strategies pointed out, the housing market is complex and there's no easy solution. That said, 3 of the action items in the Housing Tools and Strategies action inventory are addressed, at least in part, with these updates. Before we move on, another project that falls under this umbrella is the Middle Housing Code amendments. This project is developing code amendments to implement House Bill 2001 requirements intended to encourage middle housing types, such as multiplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters. An important distinction to point out is that middle housing updates will largely apply to by right development of the middle housing types, whereas the clear and objective updates make changes to the approval criteria and procedures for land use applications. In other words, middle housing changes will primarily impact building permit requirements, whereas the clear and objective changes will only apply to subdivisions, partitions, conditional uses, site reviews, and planned unit developments, or PUDs. These are the land use application types that are often required before a building permit can be obtained. The main housing constraint that this project can positively influence is related to the supply of buildable lots. By buildable lot, I mean a shovel-ready property, not just land zoned for residential use. It's a smaller amount because often a land use process is needed to create the shovel-ready buildable lots. For example, land divisions and PUDs often convert residentially zoned land into multiple buildable lots with necessary utilities and infrastructure. The clear and objective amendments are meant to make the creation of buildable lots and other required land use processes easier for housing development. In Eugene, we have both a clear and objective approval path, currently called the needed housing track, and a discretionary path called the general track. Applicants choose which approval track to use when they apply for a land use application that involves housing. With this choice, there may be trade-offs. Given the clear and objective statutory requirements, the clear and objective track offers a predictable, prescriptive plan or path, that is explicit about what is needed to get approval. The discretionary track, on the other hand, has subjective approval criteria that may allow greater flexibility in what compliance looks like, but also leaves more room for legal challenges on appeal, as there's more room to debate whether a subjective criterion has been adequately met. To get you ready before hearing testimony later this evening, I'll do a quick project refresher. We know Eugene is an awesome place to live, work, and play. This project was initiated in 2015 as part of the Envision Eugene Urban Growth Boundary Project. The contention at the time was that the existing clear and objective tracks have unworkable criteria that effectively force proposals into the discretionary path. It was also pointed out that most of the land that's easy to develop has been, leaving only the more challenging properties available for development. And 1 second, I'm having a little technical glitch here. Sorry about that. We're now nearing the end of the project. Note the yellow star marking where we're at. So here's a quick recap of our past work. The project was intentionally designed to allow incremental review from the Public Planning Commission and Council. This diagram shows our project phases, which I'll describe more in a minute. I'd like to note that throughout the first 3 phases, we did a variety of public outreach as part of a pre-process to the formal adoption. This slide shows our stakeholder groups. Again, this is a complex technical project, so we front-loaded the outreach and involvement so that stakeholders could help shape the project from the very beginning. In phase 1, we held focus groups and listening sessions to identify specific problems to address within the scope. In phase 2, we held working group sessions to dig deeper into complex issues and generate possible solutions. Then in phase 3, after drafting code language based on the approved preferred concepts, we provided opportunity to review and comment on the draft changes. Throughout the project, we've also kept the website up to date, sent emails to our IP list, held open office hours sessions to answer questions, and provided periodic updates in the Eugene Planning newsletter and Housing Tools and Strategies quarterly updates. We were here last in May of 2019 when you directed us to begin formal adoption. The motion you passed directed us to first return to the Planning Commission to revisit tree preservation standards and a few items that weren't supported unanimously before officially starting the adoption process. We returned to the Commission for 2 follow-up meetings last January and February. Most items revisited already had majority support, and that did not change. The majority of the 2 meetings was used to further refine the tree preservation standards to strike the right balance between improving the effectiveness of our requirements while not creating new barriers. At that point, we were poised to begin adoption, but responding to the pandemic slowed our progress until we were able to begin formal adoption last fall. Adopting changes to the land use code requires a legislative land use process. Formal adoption starts with a public hearing before the Planning Commission, which was held in October. Next, the commission held 5 additional meetings to deliberate and develop their final unanimous recommendation. With those steps complete, tonight you will hold the second public hearing, and then we are scheduled to return in April for possible action. The proposed amendments generally fall into 2 categories: maintenance items and significant items. Overall, the draft ordinance includes almost 80 changes to 45 land use code sections, along with a new figure and a new map. Maintenance items will create consistency between the clear and objective and discretionary review tracks where appropriate, as well as with other sections of the land use code with recent changes to state law and past legal decisions. There are also a few changes that simply improve efficiency and effectiveness without having policy impacts. This is a list of the maintenance items included in the proposed amendments. As I said, these changes are relatively straightforward maintenance level code revisions, and the summary document included in your agenda packet has a little more detail. The remaining items had potential policy implications and were categorized as significant. These issues required more involvement. In fact, the majority of the time spent throughout the project was focused on addressing the significant issues. In the interest of time, I've grouped some of these items together for a brief overview. And again, there's more detail in the agenda packet. Several proposed amendments address compatibility. First, we added a new code section with transition standards that will apply to new higher intensity development when abutting lower intensity development. For example, a large new multifamily project that abuts a low density residential zone. The new standards will apply to the clear and objective tracks for conditional uses and site reviews, which do not have a compatibility criterion now. For PUDs, compliance with these specific requirements will replace an existing one considered a barrier that requires a 30-foot perimeter buffer, even when low density abuts low density. This is a good example of how we looked for existing blunt tools and sharpen them based on the original intent and to make more efficient use of our available buildable lands. Oops, sorry. 2 items required revising our geotechnical requirements. We added new landslide risk factors and included adoption of a new Eugene landslide hazard map based on a Department of Geology and Mineral Industry map released in 2019. The map will be used to flag potential deep landslide risks to be addressed in the professional analysis. The geotech revisions also relate to the proposed removal of a prohibition on grading slopes of over 20% or greater that currently applies to clear and objective subdivisions and PUDs, and is again considered a barrier. Again, we really focused on adding clarity and fine-tuning our requirements to address the original intent of any code provisions identified in phase 1 as burdensome. Proposed amendments to street standards were to add clear and objective exceptions to meeting the requirements. We also added a new adjustment review option for situations not covered under the new exceptions, but that might warrant an exception under a discretionary review. Several amendments changed how we address South Hill study policies and PUDs. A couple changes related to open space requirements. One modifies and clarifies limitations over 900 feet. Currently, the clear and objective PUD track generally prohibits development above 900 feet. The new limitation allows limited development at a lower density than that allowed under 900 feet and clarifies what is allowed. And it's based on achieving the same or similar scenarios that we get with the discretionary track. Finally, we revised an existing ridgeline setback so that it will only apply to areas above 900 feet elevation. Finally, probably the most significant amendment relates to tree preservation, certainly in terms of the volume of new code language. We revised and added new standards that set minimum preservation based on area and elevation, allow for mitigation, include 2 alternative options for addressing tree preservation, and provide a list of allowable climate resilient tree species curated by urban forestry for replacement plantings. We also revised the approval criteria for adjustments to these standards. For partitions, we removed the requirement for tree preservation from the clear and objective track, consistent with what's required under the discretionary option. The reason is that partitions provide small scale infill development, and tree preservation and removal standards already apply to the development of housing at the time of building permit. You recently had a work session with urban forestry staff and heard about the need to increase Eugene's urban canopy. The new tree standards will only apply to a subset of land use applications, so it's not a complete overhaul of the city's tree regulations. However, I can say comfortably that these changes will improve our ability to preserve and/or mitigate trees, as the existing standard merely requires the developer consider preserving trees. This was identified as a low bar that we needed to fix. As mentioned in the memo from the Planning Commission included in your AIS, a lot of care and thought went into making the new standards reasonable and flexible to avoid creating new barriers to providing housing. So that concludes my staff presentation. Regarding next steps, we are getting close to completing this major project. Later tonight, like I said, you will hold a public hearing to hear feedback on the proposed ordinance to implement these changes. Then, as I mentioned earlier, possible action is currently scheduled for after you return from break in April. The purpose of this work session was to give you a primer before the hearing later tonight. And after the hearing, you'll have another chance to ask staff questions. So you may want to hold the more specific questions until then. But if you have any general process or project questions, I'm happy to field those now. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for running through the sort of high outline of what was a pretty robust council packet to work our way through, but actually very well prepared. So I very much appreciate that. And it looks like Mike is first in the queue. So Mike and then Randy.
Mayor, and I thank you so much for both the report and for the work. Golly, you know, yeah, so that's a lot of work. I mean, that's just an awful lot of work. So great job. I was wondering if you might characterize for me the new ordinance as proposed. What's its effect on our current buildable land supply? How would you characterize that?
I would say I can't quantify that because that would take an intense analysis to do that. However, I would characterize it as, I really think that we did a good job of making changes that would encourage a more efficient use of buildable land. And so we, like, for example, I mentioned the 300-foot ridgeline setback. That takes up a significant swath of land that is effectively undevelopable under the clear and objective review track. And the intention of that setback was to ensure that we could obtain the ridgeline trail system, which we already have. So we tried to look at what the intents were, what the actual impact of the standards were, and then to try to right size them. And so I think we were able to kind of, you know, cumulatively create some efficiencies that would improve our buildable land situation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I know that I'm not asking you to quantify because of the amount of work that's involved. And I know that, you know, there's state law governs process for how we would or wouldn't increase or decrease our actual buildable land supply based on what we've reported and based on our UGB. But you can, I would bet with your deep knowledge of this, you can certainly say, is this a net increase of buildable lands or a net decrease to buildable lands?
In so much as it's a decrease to unnecessary burdens or limitations on the use of land, I would say it's a net increase.
Okay, even with the change in 20-degree slope and above stuff, right? So there essentially there's quite a lot of stuff now that can be developed outright or with under clear and objective standards that needed review previously. Is that correct?
Well, it's also a little tricky because we have two tracks. And so to say something wasn't developable under or isn't developable under the existing clear and objective track, it doesn't mean that that land is undevelopable.
Let me rephrase. In a reasonable and affordable manner.
In that sense, I think that this will kind of unlock the ability to use the clear and objective process or paths for properties that haven't been really workable with the existing set of approval criteria.
Would you say that there are still lands that we count within our buildable land supply that are still substantially cost burdened to develop and build on?
I don't think I could make that assessment. my background's not in economics or where I could say what the cost burden was.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Okay, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Janessa. It was a lot of information. I appreciate that. I'm still trying to catch up, I think, where the rest of council is. So first of all, Mike took care of my questions around buildable land, because that's something I hear frequently, and it is a concern, especially how it drives cost. But more general question, thinking ahead for when we get together again after the break, I read all the material, some of it twice, and I read through HB 2001, not recently, but fairly recently. The challenge I'm having is connecting the two and trying to understand cause and effect relationship as far as what we're doing to amend the code and what's driving it. And that would be very helpful for me. But if I'm the only one that's a little bit confused about that, I would sure hate to have you spend a lot of time on that. But it would certainly, I think, help me with some clarity as we edge towards making some decisions on this. Thank you.
I think that would be helpful.
Would you like me to try to answer that now, or are you wanting more like some follow-up in the AIS packet to kind of tease them apart a bit?
I'd love to hear anything you have to say, but I fear that kind of what I'm looking for is probably getting down further in the weeds. And, not that I'm wanting to get into, of course, operational issues, but just trying to understand what is driving some of the decisions that we're doing, and basically how they relate to one another. And I just think that would be useful. If I had a better understanding of that, I'd probably have additional questions.
Understand. I will say that there's just really quickly, and I kind of touched on this in the PowerPoint presentation, but it might have gone by very fast. They are similar in that they're both housing initiatives. However, they really do, they're a little apples and oranges in the sense that the middle housing is incentivizing or trying to encourage a housing type. So that typically is going to be more standards that we would review and determine compliance at the time of the building permit review. So that's a separate process than our land use application review. The Clear and Objective project is focused on the land use applications. And so you're really kind of talking about two different parts of the development process: building permits versus the land use applications. That said, they are both housing, and there could be some slight overlaps, and I'm part of both projects. So I'm part of the middle housing team as well, and I'm watching for anything that would require a circle back to change any of the Clear and Objective requirements. I'm not anticipating that there will be very much besides potentially pointing to new standards that get created within the list of standards that a particular application type has to comply with.
And I know that some things are separate from 2001. I guess I'm trying to understand where they actually connect. If you take two circles and cross them, what's that part of the overlap piece? And that's where it gets fuzzy for me. So that, anyhow, I see that Councilor Zelenka was nodding his head yes as well. So that would help me immensely in trying to understand this and make sure that, however I vote is make sure I know what I'm voting on. So thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Emily.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Janessa, and your whole team for this work. I remember us talking about this in depth, and it was years ago. So a big file in my file cabinet, and I was like, I don't really remember how this attaches to everything. So I know that in that time, you and the Planning Commission have gone through all of our concerns and really teased out the best solutions. And I'm really glad I didn't have to do that. There are so many tiny details that are important and all have to align. And so I just have deep gratitude to staff and to the commission. This is a really wonderful job and good compromises. So thank you.
Thank you. There were 22 meetings, I believe, up to this one. So this is the 23rd between the Planning Commission and City Council.
Thank you. It looks like Mike has a second round of questions. Take it away, Mike.
Just real quick. As you know, Janessa, council is considering a potential franchise agreement with Northwest Natural, and all of the different points that we've been encouraged by some members of the public to consider doing with regard to infrastructure and everything else. So my question is any part of this work consider the difference in the decisions that we might make with regard to that particular utility, and or vice versa? Is any, is this code adequate to cover anything that may or may not come of a future council decision with regard to that? Or will it have an effect on our decision in any way?
I don't believe so. I will follow up on that and make sure that my assumption is correct, but we don't require that natural gas be provided to every buildable lot. And so I don't believe that that would have any impact on our criteria.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments from councilors? All right, I do want to thank you for giving us this this work session before the public hearing, because I think it will just help us be kind of in the right frame of mind when we start hearing comments and we've had a chance to look at that packet. So I appreciate you stepping up and doing this for us. It was very helpful, and I appreciate all the materials, and we look forward to circling back on the next conversation. And so with that, I think we're ready to move on to our second item, which requires that I close out of this meeting. Sorry, I moved away from my critical talking points here. Close the meeting of the City Council and convene the meeting of the Eugene Urban Renewal Agency. And with that, I will turn it over to the manager.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm actually going to turn it right over to Denny Bro, who has the right background, like in his education and professional experience and his Zoom background.
Thank you, Sarah. So kind. Good evening, Mayor, Council, Denny Bro, Planning and Development. This evening, we're going to provide an update on our Riverfront redevelopment project, including some of the project progress that we've made to date. And as important, we're going to look forward a little bit and talk about some of the project elements that remain for the Riverfront. And we've been able to accomplish a lot over the past couple of years, especially considering one of those years has occurred in a pandemic. But the work that we've done collectively has been very impressive and worth celebrating. But with that said, there are several things that remain for this project. And some of those things are going to be absolutely critical to realizing the full vision for the Riverfront project. And they include things like the vertical development, for example, which has not started. But this week we'll reach a major milestone. Atkins and Dame fully intends to make their deposit this week, which will put them on a path to purchasing the first parcels that will be developed in the Riverfront project. So it's great progress. But there's also some other things besides the development that remain for the project that we've discussed previously with council. There's the steam plant, there's parking, there's the Park Plaza, which is the second phase of the Riverfront Park. There's affordable housing, and all of those are again really important for the project. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to review where we are with the overall project, including where we are financially in the Riverfront Urban Renewal District. We're not asking for any action tonight. We're kind of just going to review where we are, but we'll be back for these to have some discussions about these other project elements in the future. And that'll probably start next month with the discussion of the steam plant. As you'll see in the presentation, getting the rest of this work done is going to be very challenging. financially and otherwise. But, the rest of this project that what we've accomplished to date has been very challenging as well. So we're optimistic that we're going to find a path forward. But the work, again, that remains is very important, and we're committed to continue to work creatively with council to figure out ways that we can push all of these remaining elements forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to talk about some of those things.
Great, thank you. Good evening, I'm Amanda Noble Flannery. Here with me for this presentation is also Will Dowdy. Together, we are the Community Development Interim Co-Directors. Today, I'll start with a brief update on the downtown riverfront construction, showing you how close we are to realizing the community's decades-long vision of reconnecting downtown to the river. To lay the foundation for thinking about what's next for the downtown riverfront, I'll provide an update on the district's financial capacity. Then Will is going to provide a brief overview of each of the 4 projects that the agency board requested more information on in October of 2019. You'll then have time for questions and discussions. And as Denny said, we're not asking for any board action during today's work session. I'll start with an update on the park. Construction of phase 1, which includes the 3-acre linear park along the river, is in full swing. This aerial photo shows what the site is currently looking like and how much it's already transformed. On the left, you can see the extension of 5th Avenue to the river. Here you can see what it looks like to stand at the future 5th Avenue overlook. To the right is 5th Avenue going under the Ferry Street Bridge. Straight ahead to the center is the Wayne Morse Federal Courthouse, and to the left is the steam plant and the river. The park improvements include new walking paths and bike paths, stormwater treatment, new native vegetation, and as shown here, future decks and seating areas. Our target for opening this part of the park is July. Phase 2 of the park, the 1-acre urban plaza. When the park opens, the plaza will have long access paths and lighting as a temporary landscape until construction starts in a few years. And you'll hear Will talk about this project in a few minutes. Here's a great example of the other construction currently happening on the site, the infrastructure necessary for folks to access the park. This image is with our backs to the riverfront park, looking toward the 5th Street Market. This extension of 5th Avenue is part of phase 1 infrastructure that will be completed this spring. This community investment is a result of council and board action to approve funding for phase 1 that happened in May of 2020. In December, as part of supplemental budget, you approved funding for phase 2 infrastructure, contingent on receiving the non-refundable deposit from Atkins Dame. Those are the developers we've previously referred to as Williams, Dame, and Associates. We expect the deposit to be paid this week, as Denny mentioned, allowing for phase 2 construction to start later this month and be completed by the fall. Phase 2 of the infrastructure services the southern parcels and the steam plant. It also provides southern access to the downtown riverfront site via 8th Avenue and Hilliard. And finally, we're excited to share the noteworthy milestone we reached in just the last week for the vertical development. After signing a new legal agreement last November, Atkins Dame completed due diligence last week and has secured the investors they need to move forward with the redevelopment. We expect Atkins Dame will provide a $4.5 million non-refundable deposit this Thursday, which will be applied to their purchase of the properties over the next 3 years. We expect to close on the sale of the first lots shown in these circles in September of this year. Those are lots 3B and C, 9, the viaduct open space, and the portions of 4 and 5 that are currently owned by the agency. Atkins Dame expects to start construction toward the end of this year with a building with at least 100 bedrooms. Now that we've seen the progress of investments that council and the agency board have made over the past few years, let's take a look at the Riverfront District's projected financial capacity. This information is also summarized in Attachment A of your council packet. The projects that have already been approved for funding include completion of Phase 1 infrastructure, including repayment of bonds, completion of the 3 Eastern Railroad Quiet Zone crossings, with $400,000 being used for acquisition of the MGP property from eWeb, completion of the Riverfront Park, and the initial design work for the plaza. After accounting for the remaining expenditures to complete these projects and district revenue projections through FY24, we forecast that there would be no funds remaining to support other projects without the sale of property. So now let's move to the forecast after taking into account the anticipated property sales to Atkins Dane. The anticipated property sales total $11.1 million to be paid at 3 closings, the last of which will occur in FY24. The forecast then takes into account projects that have previously been discussed with the agency board. These include repayment of the loan from the city, completion of Phase 2 infrastructure, payment for plaza design and construction, and replenishing the Riverfront Loan Program. After taking these into account, we project that there will be $2.4 million available for future projects. I'll now hand it off to Will.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Agency Board, for the opportunity to share all of this with you. These projects, the steam plant, the urban plaza, the affordable housing and parking, are instrumental components of bringing the community to the river. That's why, going back to October 2019, the board requested that we dedicate some time to bring you information on them. As each of these projects is uniquely important to the success of the riverfront, we will be back in the coming months, as Denny mentioned, to discuss each of them more thoroughly. And while I dive in, I want to call your attention to the additional funding information that's in the attachments to your AIS. First up is the steam plant. It's the iconic anchor at the southern end of the Riverfront Park and development site. As you may remember, following a competitive request for qualifications and proposals process, the board directed the agency director to enter into negotiations with a local team led by Mark Mixus and Mark Frohnmeyer. The team proposes to adaptively reuse the steam plant, transforming it into a vibrant mixed-use center. The ground floor would be open for visitors to enjoy art, food, drink, music, helping the steam plant to realize its potential to draw people from all corners of the community. The upper levels would include spaces that provide the fiscal foundation to make the project sustainable, such as office and residential uses. The team is still exploring the financial feasibility of these possible options. Adaptive reuse of the building is not an easy undertaking, given environmental, seismic, and fiscal challenges. With the costs necessary to address these obstacles, the project will only be feasible with investment from the city or agency. This could include providing the land at no cost, abatement of the building's asbestos, paying the system development charges and permit fees, and providing access to parking. The amount of financial assistance needed is around $3 million. Included in that estimate are 2 things that I'll explain in more detail in a couple of minutes. $500,000 for transmission line rerouting and approximately $1 million for parking. Staff have been working with the redevelopment team to draft deal points for board consideration. A work session is tentatively scheduled in April. The development team, estimates that they could start construction within 2 years of board approval of the deal points. Next, the urban plaza. Immediately adjacent to the park, the plaza will be the heart of the new downtown Riverfront neighborhood, and it's an instrumental part of bringing the experience of the river back towards the city. During the design process, the community described their vision of the plaza as being a space for the whole family, with an interactive water play or fountain feature, an adventure play area, interpretive artwork, and flexible space with programmable areas for market tents and community events. In 2019, the agency board approved initial funding for the plaza of $4 million. About half of that amount was used for the plaza's share of the infrastructure and then as well as preliminary design work, leaving about $2.1 million for future design and construction of the plaza. The full community vision for the urban plaza would require an additional $4.5 million. Without the additional funding, the agency can move forward with the $2.1 million already allocated. In that case, the plaza would be constructed with features you'd see in your standard neighborhood park, including paths, lawn, trees, site furniture, and lighting. Items like the play area, interpretive artwork, and water features would not be included. The project has the ability to be scaled between these two designs, depending on the level of funding. Connected to both the steam plant and the riverfront park, I'd like to take a detour to talk to you about the opportunity to reroute eWeb transmission lines, an opportunity to benefit not only the downtown riverfront, but also Alton Baker Park, while helping to meet eWeb's long-term resiliency plans. Currently, eWeb's lines run through the middle of the riverfront park site. The tower sits right in the middle of the park, and the lines run right over the bike path and that southern plaza area, crossing between the steam plant and the river. eWeb can reroute the lines as they run through Alton Baker Park so that they cross the river directly at the substation south of the steam plant. In this map, you can see Alton Baker is the big green area on there, and right where it says downtown riverfront, that's, I believe, right over the substation. So you can't see much of the downtown side of the river there. But what you can see is the current path of the lines in blue on this diagram and the proposed realignment in yellow. You can see the more direct river crossing in yellow and the way the blue lines run through more of the riverfront site. You may also notice that currently the transmission lines run along the Alton Baker Canoe Canal, and the new alignment would fix that. Here's a picture of the lines in Alton Baker Park. Not only would the rerouting provide a better experience for park users along this waterway, but it would also benefit the wildlife along the canal, create a safer maintenance environment for eWeb, and lay some groundwork for eWeb's future resiliency plans. eWeb, their early estimate, the cost estimate for the project is about $1.2 million. And staff have had preliminary conversations about the city or agency potentially contributing about $500,000, which would be the cost of the work on the downtown riverfront side of the river. eWeb estimates that this transmission line rerouting work could be constructed in FY23 or later. Given the community's strong desire to have the downtown riverfront be inclusive, the agency's investment in affordable housing has been discussed frequently as a way to bring a measure of housing equity to the forefront of this project, and an important factor in the overall success of the riverfront. The board set aside one lot for an affordable housing project and has identified a specific target of 75 units at or below 60% area median income, or AMI. Staff is ready to begin working with our local providers on the delivery of these units. Based on past experience, we can estimate that a project that meets the board's targets would require public investment of about $1 to $3 million, although the final amount would depend on the unit mix, the number of units, and other building features. A smaller project, something in the range of 50 to 60 units, would be competitive for different tax credits and would probably need about $1 million or even less of public investment. As requested at the last work session, we provided 2 examples of financing for local projects in the AIS packet at the end of the affordable housing attachment. And the last of the 4 projects is additional parking to support the activity of the downtown riverfront and help make this site and all it offers more accessible to more people. With the development of this size, including the new park, the plaza, and commercial uses, we anticipate needing additional parking above the on-street spaces, especially during high demand periods like nights, weekends, and during special events. Furthermore, the steam plant parcel, which only fits 25 parking spaces, does not accommodate the parking needed to support its future redevelopment into a mixed-use center. Staff have been exploring opportunities to solve for this increased demand. One part of the solution could be the construction of a 70-stall lot on the MGP site, shown on this map in brown, southeast of the substation at 8th and Hilliard. We expect to acquire this property later this spring. The preliminary cost estimate for construction of a lot here is $600,000. We've also had preliminary conversations with several neighboring property owners to explore possible parking solutions, including the potential for the city or agency to build a second parking lot with another 70 or 75 spaces. we're still working to determine the feasibility of an option like this. Overall, we estimate that providing the parking to appropriately support the other activity at the riverfront will be at least $1 million. So that concludes the overview of these 4 projects. We will be coming back with individual work sessions, as I said, on each of the projects, with the first tentatively scheduled in April for the steam plant. And with that, we'll open it up for board discussion. Amanda and I, and the project managers for each of these 4 projects, are here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both for that presentation, but really for the packet that you all prepared for council, which was very clear and easy to understand and very detailed, and I appreciate that. And it looks like we have Claire and then Matt in the queue. So Claire, kick it off.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Will and others for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I just have a series of questions and a couple of comments. This may be too difficult to speculate on this first question, but if we end up approving a MUPD for Atkins and Danes development, do we have any idea if they are thinking of including the low-income units in their development or giving money to our Affordable Housing Trust Fund?
We'll be paying the moderate income housing fee, yes, which is separate from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Okay. Sorry, thanks. I don't always get my titles correct. So in this presentation on the potential $500,000 to remove the transmission lines, I do not recall us ever talking about that before. Has this idea been presented to council before?
No, that's a new one, and that's it's something that we've been developing as we go through, as we work through the site with eWeb and through these different projects. So I'm sorry, I should have been a little bit more clear about that in the presentation, that this is something new for you. Again, our intention here is to summarize these projects and then certainly bring back more information at the follow-up work sessions.
Okay, so it would not be correct to say that this was a project of the Urban Renewal Agency. So I don't want it to be clumped in as a project that we've discussed, because we have not. And I'll just say it's not jumping out at me as a high priority. I mean, the safety thing for accessing the lines, I can appreciate that, but if we move it to another part of Alton Baker, it's just going to be an eyesore for that part of Alton Baker. So I'm going to need a lot of convincing that there's a net gain for us in spending $500,000 to do that, rather than spending $500,000 on our plaza and the things that our community has identified as important to them in terms of that public space. On the affordable housing project, I have no interest in building fewer than 75 units there. So for me, that's the floor, not the high end. And as far as parking, we definitely should be looking at as many alternatives to building more concrete parking spaces as possible. So shared parking with other parking structures nearby and getting that MGO back up and running once we're out of this pandemic. You know, there's a lot of creative ways that we can be looking to provide nearby parking, because we will need more parking for people to come. I agree. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to invest $1 million or $2 million in building more parking right by the building. So I really want us to be creative in how we look at that. I had 2 quick questions, so I'll wait for a second round.
Okay, Matt and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilor Sirett kind of zoned in on some of the things that caught my ear as well. The proposed transmission line moving through Alton Baker Park as opposed to along the Canoe Canal was explained by Will as potentially safer. I'm wondering, Will, if you could expand expand on that. Did I hear that right? And if so, if you could please explain or expand, and I got a quick follow-up.
I don't think I have a whole lot of information. Unless anyone else on our team can comment on that, that's something that we would provide more information. Oh, Amanda.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit, and we can definitely bring back more information. But some of the issues they have with the lines along the Canoe Canal is the amount of bird activity and the amount of damage that happens because of the birds around the Canoe Canal. So that is part of the goal of removing them from the Canoe Canal. And what UWeb has indicated to us as part of their longer term resiliency plans is the ideal scenario is they would completely remove the transmission lines that go through the park and make some of the lines redundant. That's a longer term plan of theirs, but this would kind of be like the foundation to achieve that.
Okay, thank you. Did I hear this right? A difference of between $4.5 million and $2.1 million equates to a playground, a water park, and art installations. Is that correct?
Yes. Hi, it's Emily Proudfoot, project manager for the Park and Plaza project. Yeah, and so basically the 2.1 can get us to a pretty basic like plaza and lawn sort of set of amenities, but. And I think the important message here is that it's scalable. So, if we want to add the playground, it'll be, a little more. And then if we really want that interactive water fountain, well, that's another sort of big chunk. Or do we want, so I think, it's worth discussing kind of the scale and scope and, and what we want to take on and do that together and kind of creative ways to fund and meet the community's needs all at the same time. So, as Jenny said, we've had many challenges across this project, and I'm super convinced that we can, solve for this one too, just depending upon how we want to, what we want to take on. So, and I'm always more than happy to have those discussions, of course.
Thank you. I didn't recognize you without you doing a drone interactive display.
Oh yeah, I didn't have a tour ready for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that's an expensive water park in a community that gets quite a lot of water. I'll just throw that out there. And then my final inquiry for the moment, Councilor Sirett mentioned getting creative about parking, and I find it curious that there wasn't for the new buildings that there isn't any conversation about parking underground. And building up on top. I see Alan shaking his head. No, I defer to my colleague who has far more experience on council than I.
So expensive.
They're more expensive. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, finding alternatives than just simply building another parking lot is attractive to me. If that's a helpful observation. Thank you.
My button was unresponsive. I apologize. Alan and then Jennifer.
Yeah, Denny, maybe you can tell us the cost differential for a surface lot versus structured parking like that. Structured parking either goes down or up, but it's like 4 times the price.
Yeah, it's probably in that neighborhood. You could probably get to $45,000-$50,000 a space
for spot.
For underground parking, significantly less for surface parking. And Williams and Dame, they still have some hope to build some underground parking. It really depends on some factors moving forward. The market, once they do a little bit more work on the due diligence for the actual cost of the project and so forth. But at least on a couple of the sites, they really hope to do some underground parking, but cost will be difficult.
Yeah, extremely expensive. Yeah, and parking is one of those, one of my new favorite acronyms is NBP, necessary but painful. And parking is one of those things. I kidded Councilor Ye that when she first got on the council, it didn't change the world, but really what we talk about is parking most of the time, and very true. I do question having a surface parking lot right next to the river, though. That location doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Moving on the other side of the railroad tracks and getting a safe pathway makes a lot more sense to me. Maybe there's other alternatives, but parking right next to the river in that prime development land wouldn't be what I would do. The transmission line, I know that's new and it's expensive, but I think that will transform that entire park and electrify the views of that new park. And also because that power tower sits right in the middle of the park. I can probably, Emily Prophet's going, yes, yes. And also the tower sit in the middle of the Art in the Vineyards with all that power lines running through the middle of it. So I think it would actually transform Alton Baker Park as well. And $500,000 to pull that off, is that the price tag? That would be cheap to do that, to reroute that. And would just come back right in, it would come across the river right into the substation, right? Yeah, so I think that would, I'm surprised we didn't think of that earlier. I thought we just thought it was just too expensive. And then on affordable housing, I ditto everything that Claire said. And that's a really important part of it in making this all work, because getting housing down there is the name of the game for a lot of this. So thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and then Randy.
Thank you. Yeah, Alan was very insightful when he oriented me on what I'd be talking about at council so often. So first off, I'm glad to hear you're looking for creative and partnering solutions for the parking. It is painful to spend millions of dollars on parking when we're trying to get people to not drive as much to begin with. So I'm glad we're looking for those options. Emily, I appreciated the way you had the park kind of oh, my brain just stopped working. We can right size it for what we can afford. And I really like, because I feel like there might be opportunities to plan for things that we might not be able to pay for now, especially in the realms of like art or stuff, that we can then look for those opportunities down the road to add in and kind of stretch what we have now so that we can still have those things later maybe. I really appreciate that way of thinking. And then I also want to echo for the affordable housing, like I can think of no reason to limit it down from 75. We've already pushed it from the middle of the development off to the side. And so to then decrease the number of units, that would be very distressing to me and would not be in the spirit of what I think we're trying to do in this area. So I would be very much against that. And thank you for the presentation. It was very good. I look forward to the work sessions that are coming.
Thank you, Randy, and then Emily.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Will and Amanda. I thought that was an excellent presentation, and the packet was extremely easy to follow. So thank you. This is speaking more towards the future when we come back to talk about this again. Do you foresee a need for us to extend the zone and the financing or increase the amount?
I don't know who that question is directed to, but
anyone.
It's that's really a policy discussion, really, with council. The urban renewal is a tool. It's been an important tool for getting us where we are today in this project, obviously. But any conversations about extending the spending limit and the duration is really a policy discussion that council would need to have. I think our message today is all of these projects are important to keep trying to figure out how we can move forward, and we're going to have to get creative one way or another. It's one of the tools that's in the toolbox, though, so it's out there, and but it is a policy discussion.
I consider this a very important project. I mean, we have one shot at getting this right, and I just would hate to see us go cheap at the 11th hour and not realize the vision that we're looking for. So I guess I'll be interested in that down the road. And then as far as the overhead power lines, do we know if those are classified as high voltage? They look like high voltage towers. Okay, well then there is a safety concern from my standpoint. We have ELF radiation that emits down from those right in the center of a park in a place where we have people gathering. The strongest extremely low frequency radiation is right under the wires themselves. As a firefighter, we always avoid fighting fires underneath power lines. There's documented cases where the electricity can be communicated down to the ground, and firefighters have actually been killed by that. So I'm always for anything we can do to bury lines. I'm sure that costs considerably more, but it would also increase the utility of our park space. But at a minimum, it just seems to me we need to get the line out the middle of a plaza where we're going to have large gatherings of people. Even the weather conditions can bring that electricity from the lines above down to ground. And there's documented cases of that happening. So that would be a concern for me from a public safety standpoint. Thank you.
All right, Emily and then Greg.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I also appreciated the handout and the charts. The plaza is really important to me because we're taking some of the riverfront and making it private, and the river really belongs to everyone. So I'd like to make it a priority that there's a place for the whole city to gather there, and not just the people who are lucky enough to live there. And I also was wondering, as Jennifer was, if we can kind of like the park blocks, plan it, but be able to implement it in stages. And I would pick a playground first because, families are struggling with money, and that's something you can do for free that gets kids outside and interacting socially. Not that I wouldn't love to have spray and play, and I certainly want art, but if I had to order them, that plaza is really important to me. Affordable housing, that's also important to me because we've already moved it away from the river, and I hate to see this be just a place for rich people to live. I imagine eventually that will all be that way, but the river belongs to everybody, and I'd like to live on it, and I'm not buying a townhouse. But I'm not moving out of Ward 1, so no worries. And yeah, alternatives to parking, climate recovery ordinance. We need to think about everything. We don't need more concrete. We do need less use of cars. I could see parking farther out and taking the MGO, or, hey, a trolley down there could be really fun. I know we don't have the money, but it would be fun. Anyway, thank you. It's going to be an interesting journey. I bet you can imagine I'm not real keen on extending anything to do with urban renewal, but it's a great project. Thanks.
All right, Greg, and then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Excellent presentation. I'm going to follow up a little bit on Councilor Groves' question. I didn't quite get the answer I was expecting with that question, but how long is it before this urban renewal district is set to sunset? Is it 2024 or 2025?
June 30th, 2024.
24, okay. And the next fiscal year turns July 1. So if we had a situation where, we get close to and determine that we built out maybe 90% of the park or the facility, and then we need more money. And I'm trying to think about, what would council tolerate as far as during doing an urban renewal extension? And do you have any idea of how much or how long you would have to extend it to get $2 million, $3 million out that would go to the project and specifically to all of the infrastructure that is going to continue to be an issue as we move forward?
I'll let Maurizio answer that question. Oh, Denny, go ahead. Of course.
Okay, he would be better than I, so.
Hi, everyone. This is Maurizio from Finance. And so there's a couple pieces to this. So the district currently brings in about $3 million a year, but the district's running out of time. As we discussed, it's going to stop collecting tax increment in FY24. So current projections show that the district is going to come up about $2.6 million short of maximizing the full $34.8 million in maximum indebtedness that was approved back in 2004. So if there wasn't that end date in the district, that hard stop, 1 or 2 more years would be sufficient to at least bring in the full amount of maximum indebtedness that's currently allowed. And then, of course, the maximum indebtedness with council action could be increased, and then you can add on to that.
So we could meet the requirements if we extended the urban renewal district maybe 2 years, go to 27.
That's correct under current projections. You know, of course, things can change as property taxes come in over the years, but that's a good estimate. 1 or 2 years would be sufficient.
And I suspect we're going to need a couple, $3 more million to finish it. So I think we ought to start thinking about whether or not we want to extend that urban renewal district, because this has been a contentious issue before. I think that, you know, council makeup has changed, and hopefully we can, you know, work together on this one and make sure that we have enough funds to finish the project. I'm still a little skeptical on the steam plant and what can be done with it. I've seen drawings, but I'm not banking on that. So just to get the plaza and the project done, that's good with me. I want to at some point consider what the impacts are of either extending the urban renewal district or just sunsetting and letting it go at 24.
Okay, Mike, and then Claire wants a second round.
Thank you, Mayor. Like my colleagues, I appreciate the report very much. It represents an awful lot of hard work, and it's certainly very appreciated. I agree entirely with Councilor Evans with regard to the financing and looking at the details of extending the district and the URD and what that would look like. For my colleagues concerned about the cost associated with the needed and the environmental impacts of the needed surface parking, I'd just like to remind them that there's adequate dozens and dozens and dozens of existing surface parking spaces available immediately adjacent to the property. All we have, and for free too. All we got to do is be willing to buy the building, and those parking spaces would come with it. So that's an idea to consider. I agree about the transmission lines that Councilor Groves mentioned and that Alan was discussing. I agree with their sentiments. And then lastly, Denny, I heard mentioned multiple times that we expect X and Dane to make their deposit this next week. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Was there any manner of review, restatement, new agreement of any kind with regard to their site plan and the development agreement itself as we move forward, and their willingness to make sure they make that deposit deadline?
No, there were some timing elements that were changed, but they've gotten through their due diligence at this point. They've indicated that their investors are all lined up, and they're making all the arrangements to make that deposit on Thursday. And
so long as we maintain the capacity for them to complete their development in the fashion that they've proposed it.
Well, at the point that they make the deposit, it is non-refundable. So our expectation is that they have already done all of their due diligence at this point. So if they've, for some reason, find some reason not to move forward in the future, that deposit is not refundable at this point because they have completed their due diligence. So that's why it's such a big moment.
And I guess that's why I'm asking about the language. Even if we don't live up to the current development agreement with regard to conditions?
We've started phase 1, and as soon as we get this deposit, we will start phase 2 of the infrastructure. That was the major thing that we really had to deliver from our side. There's a lot of other things, of course, that we've already delivered, some contingencies that have already been met, obviously, subdividing the property and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, we have both checked all our boxes on both sides.
I think we understand one another, and I appreciate your diplomacy. Thank you very much.
All right, Claire and then Alan for a second round.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just had a couple more questions. So a couple of places, 2 places in the presentation was a reference to money for parking. So talking about the steam plant, and you called out $1 million. So is it just that single instance of the $1 million that you're kind of earmarking for fulfilling parking, or is there $2 million?
No, it's $1 million said twice. So I repeated it because it's it's something that benefits the overall life in the district that is supporting that, but then it also has a direct support for the steam plant and for the functions that they're trying to do. So the parking would serve, the same parking spaces would serve double duty, and so it's 1.
Okay, thank you. And then on the money for the plaza, so you're saying we allocated $4 million, we spent some portion of that, we now have about $2 million left. And if we really want to see the full blown concept, we'd need an additional 4.5 million.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate Emily's, ideas around looking at the same way we've dealt with the farmers market and the park blocks, of the scalable project. For me in this space, I think I'm thinking for me, the most important part is a place for people to gather. The river is a huge amenity. The environment's a huge amenity. Whether or not we have to add a bunch of bells and whistles in that gathering spot, particularly at the beginning, maybe they could be added later, is another question. I do have some confusion still about these extending or moving the transmission lines. Would we be spending money on a project in Alton Baker? And does the Urban Renewal District encompass Alton Baker Park?
No, the Urban Renewal District does stops at the river, and the preliminary conversations that we've had is that that project is one that goes from the substation into Alton Baker, so it's on both sides of the river. The estimate for the cost of the work on the riverfront side, the downtown riverfront side, is about $500,000, and so that would leave about $700,000 on the Alton Baker side. And so so one question, one opportunity would be for the city or the agency to invest, to pay $500,000, which is the cost of the work inside the district, and then EWEB would pay the rest.
So EWEB's asking maybe they're not asking us anything. The discussion is that the city would shoulder the entire cost of the part that's in the Urban Renewal District.
That's the conversation. That's the conversation, yes.
Yeah. So it's a little confusing when you show us maps that include Alton Baker when we're talking about the Urban Renewal District. Sorry to be critical, but these are important details. And I'm still not convinced that this is something that we should be spending $500,000 on. I think I might be convinced, but I think we need to be very clear about trade-offs. We're going to be making trade-offs if we spend that money there, unless we extend the district, and then maybe we can get all the bells and whistles that we want. So, thanks.
Okay, Alan, and then the city manager.
Yeah, Denny, I'm interested in if you have an estimate for the investment that Atkins Dame will be putting into the parcels that they buy, 3, B, and C, 4, 5, and 9. If they build out as planned, do you have an estimate of how much investment that is in that area by them and their investors?
At this point, I think our estimation is $100 million plus. And Amanda, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but.
Yeah,
And then we also.
Total.
Go ahead.
Sorry, that's the total for all of the lots. You were asking about the parcels in the first closing?
Right. So it's just
the first building that they're going to build will be at least 22 million.
Which is that?
It'll either be on 3B and C or on 9.
Okay. All right. So total build out would be for all 1 through 10 sites, numbered sites, would be $100+ million. Okay. Thanks. That's all I have.
Manager, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One was mostly just trying to use this work session as an opportunity to let you know all of the things that are out there as possibilities, even things that are just now emerging. So you understand the full context as we start to talk about any of those individual projects. I did want to bring your attention again. I know I feel like I've been redundant about this in our meetings and also in our check-ins, but the MGP site, which we are working on the purchase and sale agreement with eWeb, is probably going to wrap up. That purchase and sale agreement will be ready to sign, and it's probably going to be ready to sign while you're on break. And I just want to remind you again that your direction was do that and sign that. And when I sign that, I am relinquishing the city's exclusive first right of refusal to the headquarters building. And I know you know that, and we've talked about it a lot, but that could come up while we're on break. And since we're talking about the MGP site and the use of that, I want to make sure while we're still here in session together that you know that.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. I also just wanted to chime in on some of this conversation, and I agree with my colleagues that it feels that the plaza, because it can be done sort of in stages and phases, feels like a priority. The affordable housing is a priority, and I would not want to reduce the number of units there either. I have a slightly different perspective on the parking area because it relates to the steam plant and the viability of the steam plant as a future kind of hub of various activities. So I mean, no one has really talked about the steam plant, but that is a big piece of this overall development and a big piece of our economic development strategy. So that's fundamentally an economic development piece. And so I just want to sort of keep that in there, that's a big economic anchor at that end of the property. And the parking may be pretty critical in terms of making that viable for those developers. So I know we'll have plenty of time to talk about that, but it's not just whether people can, get to the park. So, and also I was very interested in this packet, and each of these, all economic, all funding options are not equal, and some are maybe a little bit easier than others. And so that's the other piece, thinking about it, that there's some things that lend themselves to grants and some things that are a much heavier lift. So, as we go forward, it'll be interesting to have that played out for us in more detail as we go along. And it looks like Claire has another comment.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, because I didn't get a chance to say it. I'm still very excited about the STEAM plan and a big supporter of figuring out how we move that project forward and make it successful. And so I don't want anyone to interpret that I'm saying don't build any parking around it. I'm just saying be very mindful of how much parking you think needs to be built there. And let's be as creative as we can be in building as the minimum that we think we can get away with, rather than like, hey, we just put down a big slab, because that's the easiest thing for us to do. So I totally agree. There needs to be some parking there, but I really want to encourage us to be creative in how we think about what the actual need is and how that need can be met. And I absolutely agree that for me, the STEAM plan's a very important part of this overall project.
Thank you. And it looks like Matt, one more comment.
Stimulated a quick question. Do we have very clear outlined goals in regards to creating spaces for electric vehicle parking when we use public dollars like or abatements like this?
Looks like everyone's staring at their cameras waiting for me. I don't, oh, go ahead, Matt.
Hi, Mayor and Council. Matt Rodriguez, Acting Public Works Director. So, Councilor Keating, we have an electric vehicle strategy we're working on, and part of that is to continue to develop requirements and understand what a public infrastructure charging station plan would be. So I would say today, we don't have those clear requirements, but that's part of the strategy we're working on.
Would that strategy include the Riverfront Urban Renewal District?
It definitely can. I think it's a good point to think about it now. Obviously, we would want to have infrastructure in place to serve charging stations before we built anything. We'd have to come back and modify. So I appreciate that heads up of thinking about incorporating that.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Claire, do you want to have one more comment? Your hand is still up. No, okay. All right, I think, thank you very much for that discussion. I know there'll be many more discussions to come, and it is really exciting to think about both the park completion and opening, and that there's actually going to be construction of housing on that. I mean, it just seems unbelievable to me that we're getting to this place. So very, very exciting. So thank you all for all the work you have done on this incredible, incredible project. And we look forward to hearing more. And with that, we'll adjourn a few minutes early. I'm kind of expecting we're going to have a full night tonight. So, so drink a cup of coffee if you have to. Okay, and see you soon. We're adjourned at 7:30.